You're listening to Chai Across Generations. This is Shankar.
And this is Nikhil. This is episode 7 about mental health, stigma, and self care, which is part 2 of our 3-part series. Before we get into the main discussion, we had announced a fun competition on our last episode asking you all to identify the intro, transition, and outro music. And we have a winner.
Congratulations to Neha, a listener from the US who shared this blurb with us.
First off, thank you for producing such a wonderful and thought provoking podcast covering issues that potentially draw and fascinate multiple generations of South Asians. I might have had an advantage guessing your intro song as I grew up around a very talented rock musician brother. Brain Damage by the band Pink Floyd and sung by frontman Roger Waters is a tribute to Syd Barrett, their former bandmate who suffered from serious mental illness. I remember the catchy yet haunting lyrics to this song when I first heard it as a teenager in the 90s. It starts with, "The lunatic is on the grass," probably referencing "please keep off the grass," implying that disobeying such signs indicates insanity. The psychedelic tones, the crazy laughter, and genius lyrics of this song for many in my generation continue to reveal new meaning, understanding, and also acceptance of mental health. It's no surprise this song and others in the album, The Dark Side of the Moon, have endured and recently celebrated 50 years. It tickles me to think that my teenage son, who also enjoys 70s rock music and quizzing, would have probably guessed it within a few seconds and rattled off several more facts about the song's origins that I could have possibly known. Much like Chai connecting across generations, I'm fortunate to connect with him over such fantastic music.
Thanks, Neha, for correctly identifying the intro music.
Yes, thanks, Neha. Shankar and I owe you a cup of chai, so feel free to claim it if you'd like.
I must confess, I misled our listeners a little bit because I had planned to include 3 distinct pieces of music, one for the intro, one for the transitions, and one for the outro. But as I was recording things, it turned out that there were only 2 that I wanted to put in there, and Brain Damage was on the intro and the outro. So stick around to the end of the episode to hear about what the transition music was.
That's okay, Shankar. I think we can give you a pass on that one. Now we're going to pivot into the main part of the discussion about the stigma around mental health and the value of self-care today. Before we do that, we wanted to recap the top 5 takeaways and some closing thoughts from the previous episode to refresh your memory. Let's get into it.
Number 1. In our previous episode, we saw that mental health can be framed as an opportunity for growth and development, or as the diagnosis of an undesired or pathological condition. This growth or spiritual development can be attained through the inner practices of yoga that include concentration that builds focus and deep meditation that leads to superconscious experience. But a discussion around mental health must also include vital aspects of the diagnosis and treatment of disorders.
Number 2. Shankar shared an interesting new way of looking at mental health around the 4 quadrants of an analog clock. 12 to 3 is characterized by abnormal, pathological, or dysfunctional behavior in an individualized reality. 3 to 6 is functional behavior by an individual that can still be traumatic or painful to others around them. 6 to 9 is functional behavior that is healthy to others around them. And 9 to 12 is functional behavior and an expanding mental awareness growing towards enlightenment. We can find ourselves at different points of the clock throughout the day. And something I found quite mind-blowing that Shankar pointed out, on the surface, there's not that much difference between 11:59 and 12:01.
Number 3. Since mental health issues are subtle and not evidently obvious as, say, a broken limb, they can easily go unnoticed. Self-diagnosis of mental health issues is the hardest because most people are not aware that they are not their thoughts and they're not their mind. Formal diagnosis through questions at the doctor's office may also not uncover many personality disorders.
Number 4. Mental health patients are suffering and are often in great pain, but they can also have moments of great lucidity. Caregivers and those near and dear to mental health patients often suffer greatly too.
Number 5. We trace the origins of mental health to genetics, nurture, especially the childhood environment, and habits. And we acknowledge that good habits alone are not enough to cope with all forms of mental illness. So one cannot always say, just snap out of it.
So, now that you're all caught up, let's dive into the discussion around stigma and self care. I wanted to maybe talk about the stigma piece.
Yes.
Because one of the reasons you and I wanted to do this is that we don't really talk about mental health very much in our community, right? And I think this whole point you're making of illness, that we were making of what is illness, is very important here. Because I think there is some sense, there's an idea that if you're, like, if it's not debilitating, are you really mentally ill?
Right.
Or are you just mentally unhealthy? Or are you just not mentally healthy? There's different kind of shades of that. Right. And I think it's one of the reasons why it's so hard to talk about this. I feel like if I were to summarize some of the stigma, I would say, I think there is this idea that everyone feels sad at some point, or depressed, or lonely. So what's the huge deal, right? And what I hope that we can get to within this conversation, within our community, and within our generations, is the idea that, yes, it's true. Everyone does go through a gamut of emotions that include sadness and anger and all that. But for some people, it can be chronic or severe to the point where it is debilitating or just hard to live with it day to day. And it's not just a matter of willpower sometimes to get out of it, right? And I think sometimes I've seen it in conversations as if someone is feeling depressed, maybe they can work their way out of it, right? But I would love to create a richer understanding there, because if you have severe depression, I don't know if you can't just snap out of it.
I'm glad you used that phrase. I'm glad you used that phrase, because snap out of it is exactly what came to my mind. And I must say that my thinking has changed over the years. In fact, I think when we think that way, it was maybe programmed into me growing up, that, to make light of mental health issues to begin with, and to say, yeah, just snap out of it. Like, why is this such a big deal? And I've changed my mind radically about that through my own, I guess, life experience. And I think you cannot say that easily. There's a huge spectrum. We can't speak for other people that easily to begin with. And, I think what happened in the generations that I saw as I was growing up, so my parents' generation, my grandparents' generation, is that mental illness was only considered illness if it was in that 12 to 3, that's why I gave you the clock, where it was absolutely debilitating to the point of activities of daily living could not be performed, the person wasn't able to care for themselves, or they were a threat to themselves or a physical threat to others. It's only under those circumstances that they would be called mentally ill, and sometimes the terms were not very even forgiving. It's like Vaitiam or something like that. And the options were also not great. I think you would be sent to a mental asylum at that point. There was electroshock therapy and all kinds of pretty, dodgy sort of things. There are also other traditional forms of treatment, which I've read some recent reports that say they can sometimes be effective through a certain sort of religious procedure. There's a place called Chotanikarai where there are kinds of exorcisms and things like that. But overall, there was a lot of latitude, in my opinion, for a lot of personality disorders and trauma inducing behaviors were allowed as okay. It was never called out and it was never diagnosed. And I think there was probably, like you said, there were other priorities. Maybe when you have a greater need to establish your physical safety and things like that, these things become less important.
Yeah.
That's one explanation that I can think. There's another very important explanation that suddenly came to me, which is the importance of family and family name. And this
Yeah.
became very, very, at least I'm pretty sure it's there in the last two generations, from speaking from my generation back, and maybe even before. And it's strongly tied to this arranged marriage thing. You see, to admit that there is mental illness in your family means that there's a genetic component. And if you said that, the chances that you could get someone in your family married to another person in the village or community was going to drop off exponentially.
Yeah.
So there was a great need to conceal it. Right?
Yeah.
Think about it. In fact, this over exaggerated pride in family, often with no yardstick, just a self glorification, a navel gazing thing, is so common in South Asian families that it used to bother me a lot. Because the truth is, when you examine your family and if you actually look at the entire spectrum of behaviors that you may see, and then you go and talk to other people, you find that this is there everywhere. In fact, in Tamil we say, Veetukku Veetukku Vasapadi, which means that in every family, there's going to be someone. This is part of human nature. It's not like any family is so special that they're completely immune to it or something.
Right.
I think many of these fall within a certain span of genetic variation, perhaps. And so I think acknowledging that was virtually impossible given the marriage system.
Right. Yeah, I think those are fantastic points. I wanted to hit on something similar around family and the nature versus nurture piece of this. Because I was thinking, I think there is one train of thought that this is completely nurture, right? Like, and this idea, as we think about the stigma, that you look okay, so you should be okay. We don't know what's going on in the mind, right? By definition. But you look okay, so it's fine. Just like go through your day, figure this thing out, push harder, exert your willpower, get over it. Like I see some of that interaction sometimes between our generations. And growing up, I saw some of that between folks of my generation and folks of the other generation. And two stats that I found that I wanted to share comes from a Stanford Medicine article that I found on major depression and genetics. First, at least 10% of people will experience a major depressive disorder at some point in their lives. And that number, 2 times as many women as men, according to this article. That's striking. 10% is a large percentage. And so I think I would like to be more compassionate to the fact that depression is a real challenge. And we live in a society that is also increasingly into social media, right? And you can't help but compare yourself. Kids maybe are comparing themselves at younger and younger ages. That has effects. The second thing they say is around 50% is genetic and 50% is from other factors. Call those psychological or physical factors. So I wanted to maybe highlight the point that a piece of your mental health, let's call half according to this Stanford Medicine article, comes from your genetics, and the other half comes from maybe your environment and other things, right? And so I think it's important to acknowledge that that piece, that we don't know, we can't control everything based on the nurture side, because it's never been entirely nurture. It's been, according to Stanford Medicine, half nature, half nurture. And the other thing I wanted to say is, building on your point about family, I think the focus on family in South Asia has a lot of positives, right? The strong family structure is at the core of a lot of the society. There is a lot of beauty in that and a lot of really good stuff that comes from that. I feel like it's one of our strengths as a community. But it also leads to shame and embarrassment and the age-old question, what will other people say? What will other people think about our family, right? And that's where mental health becomes very difficult to talk about. And I think that's where some of that pressure comes to of, let's say someone is struggling, right, in your family, or let's say you're a parent and your child is struggling. I think there is a little bit of pressure of, I don't want, what will the rest of the community think if I were to say my child is feeling depressed? What will they think of us? And like you were saying too, what does that say about our genes or our family? So that's where I think the family tie can work against us, and where I hope we can, as individual families and then as a broader community, find a way to be more compassionate, right, to the challenges, the daily challenges that many of us will face around mental health, and the acute challenges that some people face more than others.
You raise many good points, and particularly two of them stuck with me. I'm not sure the name of this Harvard professor, but I read an article in which he describes three main threads that affect our self-concept and the notion of self-satisfaction. One being genetics, one being environment, and one being habits. And I found this to be a very, very powerful formula, or you may say a framework, through which to analyze much of my life. There's definitely a genetic component. And the interesting thing is we cannot change the genetic component. There's definitely an environment we grow up in. And until we become an adult, major, you cannot change that environment either, most often. The only thing we have in control are our habits. And to me, that was a very powerful learning. And, acknowledging that there are those two other factors is kind of exactly what you're saying, which is that merely habits may not be able to fix everything. You maybe need some additional help from, maybe talk therapy or something like that. There may be other interventions needed, and everything may not just happen by saying snap out of it, and that habit may not be enough to overcome some of even the childhood experiences. There are some people who suffer tremendous traumas that we cannot even imagine. And again, I think I mentioned this in a previous episode of our podcast, this book I highly recommend called The Body Keeps the Score by Bessel van der Kolk. He talks about the mental health institutions in this country as he was kind of growing up and becoming a psychiatrist and training and things like that, and how they used to be, the asylum where they would take people, and how in the early days there was a lot of space for talk therapy in the hospitals. And then once the pharmacology entered psychiatry, and the pharma companies started making drugs that were essentially able to control people in ways that could not be done before. So they would need physical restraints. Now they use drug restraints, right? And he laments that overnight, these kind of drab old offices, which were just rooms for people to talk to each other, were suddenly transformed by these glitzy, well-funded things where everybody's sent home and you're given a drug which is going to completely alter your neurochemistry, biochemistry, and keep you in some sort of a state which may or may not be desirable. And so I think that's also an important part that we may come back to later, but I think I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit here. I did want to come back to your other point, which was the influence of family. And I think you're touching on something that I also completely agree with, which is in some ways family is a huge resource. And in my opinion, as we were growing up, the more traditional large joint family was able to absorb a lot of relatively minor mental health issues by providing people contact with a wide range of family members. And in some sense, the family bore the burden of individual mental health problems, and it provided like this giant cushion. You know, now what's happening is, as we become very nuclear, and people live alone, so many people live alone, isolation itself is a cause of mental illness. When you don't have somebody to talk to, it really becomes very difficult. And then what I feel happens is we allow certain extreme behaviors to manifest, such as someone picking up a firearm and going out and letting loose. I believe that when we had the larger family structure, although there was a price paid by everyone to put up with people with tremendous eccentricities and idiosyncrasies, it provided a cushion, and so the extreme events were contained a little bit. It's a theory I have. I've grown up looking at people in my extended family and thought, this kind of behavior should have you committed. This is pathological. This is trauma inducing and all that. And now that I've grown up and I've seen social isolation and I've seen all of it and I've seen the extreme behaviors, I'm starting to think that maybe it was just another way of therapy in some way. It was not obviously pleasant for the people experiencing it, and they were not qualified therapists. But I think even modern psychology says that the more social contact you have, it's actually an antidote for connection. I mean, connection is the antidote for isolation. It's the antidote for many kind of ruminating behaviors and things like that. So I think for sort of mild mental states that go into the negative side, I, from personal experience, have found that talking to a friend about it is really useful. But maybe it doesn't work for everyone. And after all, this is the reality of the society we live in. So we have to adapt our methods now.
Right. Yeah, I like your theory a lot. I think that's a great point of the family serving as a form of therapy, as a form of relief in some ways. It makes me think about COVID and people living in COVID, especially people living alone in COVID, and how isolating and uncertain and just damaging to our mental health, right? That must have been for so many people. It made me, what you said also made me think that, we'll probably talk about forms of therapy separately or on a future episode. But I did want to talk about this idea of self-care. So based on one's own mental health and one's own things, causes of anxiety or things that make them happy, I think it's really important that we think about how we focus on our mental health. It could be therapy, it could be meditation, it could be yoga, it could be journaling, it could be it could be taking a walk. I mean, physical exercise is great for that. I just hope we all have a toolkit that we can draw on and use those to help us, especially, as you were saying, as we are increasingly living in nuclear families, we are living alone and not in, households that have 3 or 4 generations in them at the same time. And I will say for myself, I have recently started doing some journaling and writing down some affirmations for myself in the morning to just try to bring a certain mindset into the day, one of more warmth and compassion toward myself and toward others. And I think it's helped me, but I like what I'm trying to do is try different things. I also dabble in meditation. I go to therapy, and this helps. They help in different ways, but I believe it's important to manage our mental health, right? In the same way that it's important to manage our physical health. I think we can all get behind the fact that we should go exercise with some regularity, even if it's just a walk outside or whatever, right? And I hope I hope that we can, as a community, say, what are we doing on the mental health side for each of us as well?
concludes our second part of this discussion on mental health. Nikhil, I'm impressed by this excellent set of useful habits you've consciously cultivated to promote your mental health.
Thanks, Shankar. It's something I've created over a long period of trial and error, and it's still a work in progress. Some days are definitely better than others. What are your useful coping strategies for mental health?
After we recorded this episode, I had a peculiar revelation. And I realized that, unlike you, it's hard for me to open up and talk about my personal experiences as easily. But music is a proxy for that. And I was thinking that I often put my music out there to speak for things that I might be feeling. And I do admire the transparency and ease with which I think many of your generation speak about your personal experiences. And it's something I find admirable in its best form, which you know what I mean, that when it uplifts us in that sort of authentic and transparent way. In the same way, I guess music allows me to express myself in ways that spoken interactions don't. And actually, to be honest, as I was growing up, it served as a kind of legitimizing cover to express the inexpressible or unacceptable or difficult to convey emotions. So I think talking about the music that goes into our podcast is one way to give me a cue to maybe talk a little bit more openly about my own personal experience. Otherwise, it's a lot easier for me to think abstractly and propose a theory.
Right. Well, I appreciate you for sharing that, and that's what I enjoy about our conversations. Just access to a whole new world, because music plays a different role for you than for me, and clearly a very important role for you as you're learning to express yourself. I have to say, Shankar, that I really admire the way that you weave theory and history and spirituality into your answers, and you're helping me to think more expansively through our conversations as well. So perhaps we're both picking up new ways of thinking and relating from one another. What do you think makes music so special to you?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I do think we're learning a lot from each other. And, this podcast is, in a sense, almost therapeutic for me, and I hope likewise for you. We talked about this business of, you mentioned that it's through trial and error that you've come to this set of excellent practices. And I was just thinking that when we normally present ourselves to the world, we present our best foot forward. When someone asks you how you're doing, we always say, I'm doing great. But that might not always reflect the true reality of the realm of mental states that we're going through, right? So I think of it as what they call chiaroscuro in art, right? There's the dark and the light. And we generally try to present the happy side. But I feel there's a dark side, I would hazard, in almost everyone. And for me, I would say there is an attic, and I've worked through that attic, and in that attic there is sadness, there's frustration, there's depression, there may be resentment, there may be suicidal thoughts. And music was one way to bring all that out, both through instrumental music and also through the lyrics of the songs that we listened to, because they spoke to us. So as you heard in the intro music, we picked this thing called Brain Damage because, as Neha mentioned in her contribution entry, that it talks about mental illness of one of the band members. And the lyrics are very poignant because they talk about a piece. One part of the lyric goes to raise the blade and to make the change, which is almost seems to be referring to lobotomy, which was a standard medical practice in earlier times. Pink Floyd definitely was a band that had more than just that song dedicated to their frontman, Sid Barrett. Sid Barrett was one of the founding members, and he'd had a bad acid trip, and then after that was never the same again, and it just became a very sad outcome. But I think it spoke to a lot of us who were going through maybe our own challenges, and sometimes you find music as a place where you can focus all your energy in a way that displaces it from ruminating on some negative thoughts. So, rumination on something negative is a form of sucking up your energy. There's another way to put your energy. And when you do that, I think that dedication brings out your skill. It sharpens your skill so that in the end, every note has to count for something. So when you listen to the great musicians play, every note they pick, the way they play it, the nuance, the timbre, the tone, the timing, gives it a very poignant feel. And I realize that for some people, music is also something they may listen to in the background. And, when we started this podcast, we had the choice of picking music from stock,
Right.
non-copyrighted, royalty-free music. But we chose not to do that. And we chose to actually record our own music, mainly because I think, as I said, that was a form of expression. Coming to the second song, which is by Peter Green, and actually that song was the original Fleetwood Mac. Some of you may have heard of Fleetwood Mac. It's became very, very popular as a pop band, the Stevie Nicks version. But before that, they were a blues band that originated in Britain. And Peter Green was this most amazing guitarist, and so good that B.B. King, said that he was one of the, guitarists whom he respected in England, and among the sort of many white guitarists who came out of England in the British invasion. A lot of music came out of Britain to America in those days, starting with the Beatles and the Rolling Stones and Led Zeppelin and the Who. But Peter Green was the top of the top, and he suffered from mental illness. He also had a bad acid trip, I think, and then started giving away all his money to charity and left the band and worked as a hospital porter for a while. And then he had a comeback and continued to play some music, but definitely his phrasing, his playing is very, very emotional. And I just wanted to share that I feel this connection and a way that we can channel that energy so that that it brings joy in some way to everyone. And I think that's pretty amazing. And so when we look at someone who may be on the surface, they may look to occupy a different reality from us and may behave strangely. I think it's good to remember that deep inside there is a human being, right? And who's probably in a lot of pain. And sometimes it can come out in the most beautiful ways. And so that can open our hearts and be a little more compassionate when you see mental illness. So that's kind of what I wanted to say.
Right. Thank you so much for sharing that. There's so much depth there and so many experiences that musicians draw upon, right? And I didn't know the history about either of those songs, so thank you for sharing that with us. Mental health is a big topic, as you alluded to, Shankar, and I know everyone has their own perspective on it, so we'd love to hear from you as the audience as we conclude our mental health series next time with part 3 about generational support and healing. Follow us on Instagram at Chai Across Generations, or email us with comments, questions, or discussion topics at chaiacrossgenerations@gmail.com.
If you like what you've heard, subscribe to our podcast and please leave us a review on Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts. Reviews really help other people find our podcast, so we really appreciate it if you would drop us one.
Yes, and we'll be back next week with another episode over a delicious cup of chai.
See you all next time.